Welcome to today's South-South News. I'm Bill Miller. One of the main goals of South-South News is to focus attention on economic, social, and developmental activities that are taking place, especially in economically developing countries. Today we're going to talk about an organization that works very closely with the economically developing world. That is the United Nations. And my guest is someone who's very knowledgeable of the United Nations. Mr. Malloch-Brown has served as the Vice President of the World Bank. Later, he headed the United Nations Development Program, and he served as Chief of Staff and Deputy Secretary General to United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan. Mr. Malloch-Brown recently penned The Unfinished Global Revolution, The Pursuit of a New International Politics. Mark Malloch-Brown, welcome to today's South-South News. I appreciate you being with me today. Let's talk about your book. It's a very interesting book, and let me hold this up. It's The Unfinished Global Revolution, The Pursuit of a New International Politics. It's a very interesting book. It has a lot of insight into not only the United Nations, but also these international issues that impact people all around the world and in local communities. What motivated you to write this book? Well, how did you decide you wanted to talk about the unfinished global revolution?
Well, I think two things really. One, is written for every young man and woman who is like me 30 years ago, who was about to embark on an international career and was wondering what it was going to be like and what the challenges and opportunities would be. So a little bit of this book is memoir and plea to those people to jump in and do it, to tell them what an exciting career it is. The other bit of it is, if you like, manifesto, because the book tries to tell the story of how we failed time after time to build a system of international institutions fit for purpose, to deal effectively with the problems of a globalized world. It goes on to say that it's not just the global institutions which are failing, that national and local ones are as well, but the fundamental idea is that we've got to have better ways of governing ourselves globally.
Mm-hmm. Now, that is the unfinished global revolution, that we need to develop institutions. And of course, we think back to 1945. Europe lay in ruins, parts of Japan have been destroyed. Over 60 million people died in World War II, and the UN was created in 1945 out of the ashes of World War II, but the world is different today. How is that world different, and what type of institution do we need? What are some of the changes maybe that the UN, we'll pick the UN since we're talking about it. What should the UN do today that maybe it did very well back in 1945, but today it could improve?
Well, the circumstances of 1945 were extraordinary. It was the end of a world war of whose scale and epic character we'd never seen before in human history, and a generation of leaders wanted to make sure we never did again. And so the UN was an enormously ambitious construct and well ahead of its time. It also was a very pragmatic and practical one. We've suffered from years in which conservatives and liberals alike have made common cause in trying to claim the UN was just a kind of idealistic thing, a pipe dream in the eyes of conservatives, a bid for a utopia in the eyes of liberals. And in truth, this was some very, very practical politicians, the best politicians of their generation, people like Roosevelt and Churchill and Truman, who said, you know, never again, how are we going to govern ourselves more effectively? How are we going to deal with global security and global development and poverty? So the institution, you know, was way ahead of its times in some ways. It got completely arrested and pushed off track by the Cold War. But it does still have a lot to it, and if you were to sit down again and try to design it now, you probably wouldn't come up with as ambitious a charter as we did then. But you're right, it's been just overtaken by the sheer scale of events. It started with 48 members, now it's 192 member states. It started in a world less than half the size of the world today. It started in a world where there was a kind of autarkic trading system. Countries broken by war were not doing that much international trade. It was a world where the United States was a huge proportion of the global economy and of global arms spending, and was in some ways the only country left standing. So, you know, all of those sort of geopolitical, economic underpinnings have dramatically shifted in the intervening years.
Well, let's look at some individual segments, if you will, some of the organs of the United Nations. There are 6 organs, as I recall. Let's look at the General Assembly. That's the 192-member, the Forum of the world meeting place where the countries come together under one roof. What could the UN, or what should the UN maybe think about doing to make the General Assembly more effective and more efficient in the year 2011, 2012 as we move into the 21st century?
Well, I think there's 2 issues. There's legitimacy and membership. The legitimacy issue is that, the General Assembly has become a kind of talking shop whose resolutions cause much excitement amongst its 192 delegations, but very little impact for the most part beyond the walls of the General Assembly itself. So there's a whole issue of renewing its purpose and its authority. And I think the route to go that way is the second thing, which is its membership. It's just member states, and formally that, I suspect, will remain the case. But it's got to find a way of bringing in the power of civil society, of global society. And I think the social media offers a huge opportunity, because the UN is a crowded little campus on the east side of New York. It can't suddenly contain 40,000 civil society activists or whatever. But through social media, through the UN equivalents of Facebook and Twitter, it can become an institution which is much more connected to the pulse of global public opinion and much more reflective of it, and get out of being this sort of dry, I'm sorry to say, largely irrelevant intergovernmental debate.
And of course, that is something that they need to look at, as many of them want to look at that, and also the number of issues they confront, the number of resolutions that come through the General Assembly. I know previous presidents have tried to reduce that number to a more manageable load so that they have more time to reflect on them, and they perhaps have more meaning as they come out. The Security Council, that is the most powerful arm of the organ of the United Nations, 15 members, 5 permanent members with veto. How has the Security Council evolved over the years from the time we were fighting the Cold War in the Security Council with the USSR and the USA taking their friends, going one way, they went one way and we went the other way? How is that changing today, and maybe what should be done to, again, make it more effective and more efficient?
Well, I think the Security Council in some ways has got to remain at the center of any set of reforms if they are to really take and achieve what people want to see. And, here, of course, the Security Council, a little bit like the G8 in economic affairs, has become increasingly unrepresentative of the real sort of dispersal of global power. Similarly, like the same way that it took a financial crisis for the G8 to become the G20, I suspect it needs, I fear, some kind of security crisis to make the Security Council kind of reset itself for these new times. There's been a perennial effort to expand its membership with new permanent members, frankly, the politics that has gone on around that has sort of held the whole institution hostage now for quite a few years. And yet, in a way, it's also served a purpose, because when Kofi Annan and I were here, there were certain countries which seemed to have an absolute claim to permanent membership. Germany, Japan, Brazil, India, and obviously African representation, which was not determined as to what that would be. Well, as time's elapsed, some of those claims have worn better than others, in fact, in terms of share of global power. And so, I think it may make the reform, when it comes back, be less about new permanent members and more about kind of long-term membership, which, as global power shifts, it will allow the flexibility for the membership to shift and respond to that, rather than sort of locking in to a 2011 distribution of world power, which doesn't last longer than the 1945 one has, and would just 50 years from now give us another crisis of legitimacy and membership of the Security Council.
You alluded to the veto and having perhaps long-term members as opposed to having permanent members who have the veto and who can veto resolutions which are theoretically binding on the countries that they're applied against. But in a situation like this, should the veto be continued, or should they look at that, maybe review it? Of course, getting the 5 permanent members to do this may not be the easiest thing in the world to do.
No, look, I think it's very difficult. You know, in a world of perfect politics, you probably would say now is the time to remove the veto. In the real politic in which reform must take place, it seems to me it's unlikely to be removed entirely, but I would hope, A, that through a lot of sort of procedural reforms you can really diminish and narrow its use, and that has already happened over recent years. Vetoes are now exceptional events which provoke a lot of controversy, and where, you know, the US and others try to avoid them as much as they possibly can. But the second thing is, you know, 2 wrongs don't make a right, and to give new members the veto that the old ones have enjoyed, I don't think that's the answer either. That's just going to kind of increase those who can gridlock and hold the whole system hostage.
Mm-hmm. Well, you talk in your book here, The Unfinished Global Revolution, the Pursuit of New International Politics. What would the strategy be? Who should start launching the pursuit of a new international politics? Who should take the lead on this? Somebody has to move it on from the drawing board to the strategy session into implementation.
I think we're in a strange world now, because, you know, I don't think it will be some great world statesman, an American president, or a leader from Europe, or even indeed any other region who will be the sort of mover in the way that Roosevelt was for the UN at the beginning. I think it is going to be much more alliances of civil society organizations, of NGO advocates, working with a handful of member states who are fellow activists around certain issues, in the way that NGOs, veterans, peace groups worked with Canada on landmines, or the way similar groups worked with Norway on various more recent weapons issues, and the way that, you know, a group of countries worked similarly together with NGOs on health issues like HIV/AIDS, or on the issues of rainforests. We're seeing more and more of these coalitions coming together which embrace business, NGOs, a handful of activist states, foundations, occasionally celebrities. And these are the new, if you like, these are the new politicians of this much more disparate, varied kind of international system than believing it's a statesman president or a statesman secretary general of the UN who's going to have the vision to lead alone.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're talking today about the United Nations, and the UN, we don't want to be negative about the UN. The UN does accomplish quite a bit. We remember that the UN brings together all the 192 countries of the world, every economic system, every political party is involved, every religion is represented at the UN, every language, all 6,000 plus languages at the United Nations. There's tremendous diversity there, and a lot of foreign policy people say it's amazing they accomplish what they accomplish, and the UN has accomplished much over the years, and there are problems, as always with any organization. One area that is probably the most visible at the UN is peacekeeping. It's probably now today, I guess, about 20% of the budget, maybe 22%, something like that, maybe a little more. But it's very important. But if we went out on the streets of New York or London or Mumbai or wherever it might be, the average person would say, when you think of the UN, you think of peacekeeping. The peacekeepers, there are, what, 14 missions right now, with one political mission in Afghanistan. And they, overall, I think they've had over 63 missions since it was established in 1948. But most of those missions have been relatively successful, except there have been some that have had setbacks. Somalia was one. In Bosnia, the peacekeepers got thrust into a situation they didn't go in, they weren't even supposed to be doing, but they wound up doing it. But how do you see peacekeeping evolving? How was it when you were at the United Nations as opposed to how it is today?
Well, I was there during the years of its dramatic growth under Kofi Annan, where when he came into office, peacekeeping seemed very discredited. There'd been some disastrous missions, such as Somalia. And then, under Kofi, there was a huge expansion of peacekeeping. It went up to more than 100,000 peacekeepers, huge increases in budgets. And the frustrating thing is that the world has not really resourced it to be done well. They don't allow the common standard training of units from different national forces. They don't really allow a single system of control and command or of standby forces. They don't put enough emphasis on police as well as on military. They haven't got the right conditions for the civilian staff, of conditions of service. I could go on and on and on. The good news is it creates a peacekeeping at about 1/10 the cost of NATO or US peacekeeping. And has a very good track record of avoiding conflicts. In fact, in a way that's why there isn't more news about peacekeeping, is because of all the wars that don't happen, because the peacekeepers are out there. But it is a bit of a kind of Heath Robinson underinvested sector, which if it's going to take on these more robust tasks like it's done this week in Côte d'Ivoire, or have a role in Libya, it's going to need to be more properly resourced and equipped than it is now.
Mm-hmm. Let's take Libya. You brought that up, and we've seen quite a bit of turmoil in the several of the northern African countries, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt. How could your concept of the new international politics play into this, and what could be brought into play to help resolve this problem, maybe to anticipate it, although it came very quickly, but to help resolve the problems and to help the people work out their differences?
Well, my book actually talks about 10 years ago as head of UNDP, publishing the Arab Human Development Reports, which were written by Arab authors and were an absolutely devastating critique of Arab political economies, of their deficits of democracy, of secular education, of rights of women, and the effect this was having on massive youth unemployment, on sclerotic political systems. And everybody applauded it, and in fact, Arabs themselves loved it. 1 million copies downloaded in the first few weeks in Arabic of the first of these reports, the biggest bestseller the United Nations has ever put its name on. But it didn't change these regimes, and the regimes bitterly resented these reports, and 10 years later we are where we are. But I think, in a sense, this is what's happening is an object lesson in UN action, in that the UN wasn't particularly active in Egypt and Tunisia. It was left to the United States and others to take a hand in those transitions. But that was the diplomatically preferred way, where people themselves, ordinary Egyptians and Tunisians, demand and won peaceful change, and are now in the process of moving towards elections and choosing their own leadership. And you have a sense of countries with a broad enough middle class and enough history of pluralism and freedom that they'll, I hope, be able to exercise the democratic opportunity effectively and produce a stable, legitimate government. Libya is right at the other extreme, a still largely clan-based society operating on a system of blood patronage, where anybody who's shown any signs of being a kind of middle-class intellectual with independent views gets thrown in jail for life. And as a consequence, any of the sort of growth of a kind of pluralistic civil society base that might provide the opportunity for these people is not there. And so you worry a lot about the transition in Libya, or if it comes in Yemen and some other places as well. So I think we've got a mixed picture ahead of us on this, but an exciting one.
It certainly is. And of course, the United Nations is usually the 9/11, the last call. If people cannot resolve their problems, they call the United Nations, and then the problems have festered to the point where they're sometimes intractable and very difficult to deal with. And that's so often what's put on the doorstep. I know when you were at the United Nations with Secretary General Kofi Annan, that was certainly the case, and it will be the case, I'm sure, in the future. I guess we focus on peacekeeping, we focus on Security Council, General Assembly, but there's a large part of the UN out there, 70% more, that's dealing with providing, the family of the United Nations, dealing with providing assistance to people to help move aircraft, ships, weather information, mail around the world that we never read about, we never hear about, but those services are vital to all of us, and we would certainly miss them. Well, we couldn't do without them. We have to have them. There's no way we can get by. Would United Parcel or Service or FedEx wants to send their planes around the world, they certainly depend upon the International Civil Aviation Organization to a large degree to bring the airlines and the companies and the governments together to crack the rules and regulations to move them. So we've got a large part of the United Nations that we didn't have a chance to talk about today, but we'll have to do that in another interview. But again, you've got an excellent book here, The Unfinished Global Revolution, The Pursuit of a New International Politics. And Mr. Mark Malloch-Brown, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on South South News.